On today's show, Houston Rockets salary cap breakdown. What's the best outcome for Fred VanVleet's contract situation? Will the Rockets be able to have access to the mid-level exception to add a little bit more depth to this roster? And do they have one more significant trade up their sleeves? It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. And joining us now is a very special guest, founder of the Third Apron Podcast and Newsletter, Yossi Gozlan, NBA salary cap analyst. Yossi, thank you so much for joining us here on Locked On Rockets to help kind of break down the Rockets salary cap situation in the immediate aftermath of the Kevin Durant trade, and still with the contract negotiations for Fred VanVleet on the horizon, possible extensions for Jabari Smith Jr., Tari Eason. It's going to be a busy offseason for Rockets.
Yeah, they already got a lot of the stuff out of the way, as you mentioned, or Steven Adams, the KD trade. I still think they might have another, like, not quite like KD level move, but I think they could still have like a pretty big move left in them with their flexibility and the draft picks that they saved. So yeah, time will tell. We'll see what they end up with, if they have anything else up their sleeve.
Certainly an exciting time. We're going to get into some of that speculation here in just a moment, but I want to start first and foremost with just kind of your thoughts on the KD trade itself as kind of an unbiased third party, separate from, any affiliation with the Suns or with the Rockets. Kind of what's your evaluation of the deal for both sides? And, because, my takeaway is the Rockets came out like bandits, getting off the Jalen Green contract, adding, a future Hall of Famer in KD. What's your read on that deal and how it went down?
As far if you're looking at the price in terms of what they gave up, and also relative to what the Suns originally gave up to get KD 2 years ago, yeah, that's a very low cost to pay to bring in top. I'm a little lower on where he stacks in the league now with age. I would say he's like top 20 to maybe 25. Maybe he is a little higher, but I always got to assume for a little bit of regression. As far as like the fit and what they're going for, yes, I really like it. Another big wing to help keep the Rockets, the defensive rating at the top. This shouldn't take away from their defense. Losing Dillon Brooks might, but they, for the most part, now Jalen Green's gone, so kind of a balance there. As far as like, obviously you can't really like look into the past, but the thing that kind of bothers me is like I think the Rockets have done an excellent job in the years that they have like leading up to this with their drafting and asset accumulation. Some of the contracts they gave out, like giving Fred that contract, which ended at the perfect time, and Dillon Brooks, that contract aged easily. The only thing that kind of like I don't think anyone's really talking about, because it's so far from the past. The only thing that kind of bothers me is like, well, you could have taken Evan Mobley 4 years ago, and the Rockets would be in like a completely even better like situation. Obviously, the roster would probably be a lot different. And there's a butterfly effect. Maybe they don't have the opportunity to select Thompson later, but so that's the only kind of it's not like, I know people don't really care. It's like in the past, but that's the only thing that kind of bothers me. But yeah, as far as what the price is, really the only thing they gave up of value, in my opinion, is the 10th pick. I think Dillon Brooks is pretty valuable. I think the Suns could probably get a lot of interest from other teams. But yeah, Jalen Green, for the most part, he was just salary filler. So I just think they need to do another move, though, because with the way the starting lineup projects, I do think they need a little bit more scoring, a little bit more shooting. So I'm curious to see if they have another move left in them.
And they very well might. And we're going to talk about some of those kind of possible options a little bit later on in the episode. But first thing that I want to kind of address here, and a lot of people asked for this. I went on social media and I said that we were going to be recording a pod together. And, I had a lot of people submit some questions, things that they would like to hear about. And one of the overwhelming responses was, is it possible, please, Yossi, if you could kind of dumb it down for everybody, how the first and second aprons, it's kind of collectively like, what does it mean to be under the tax, over the tax, then the two apron levels that we have now? A lot of this terminology kind of goes over, some, casual fans' heads. So if we could just walk through it really quickly and get a brief kind of synopsis on what it means. That way, when we get into some of this terminology here in a moment in regards to Fred VanVleet's contract and what the Rockets may do there, any possible extension for Kevin Durant, the extensions for Jabari and Tari. I'll let you're the professional, You're the pro, walk us through it.
So I guess we'll start at the top, which is, and there's the second apron restrictions, but now the Rockets are not going to be able to exceed the second apron because they aggregated to get Kevin Durant's contract. They're not going to exceed it. So the main restrictions that they are currently subjected to are the first apron restrictions. So if the trade, the way they structured is to send out just a little bit more salary than Durant's incoming amount. So they are now, so by doing that, they're allowed to exceed the first apron. And right now, that might be what ends up happening. Right. I know there's a reporting that they're going to decline Fred VanVleet's contract, but assuming that they resign him, and then, you still have the Jock Landale's contract. You could waive him. They have Aaron Holiday team option. You can decline that. Right now you want to operate as if you're still going to exceed this first apron, but in all likelihood, if they don't have another big move left in them, then they'll probably want to get below the first apron, even the tax altogether. But right now they structured this trade that if it doesn't expand, then they have a week and a half to expand it. Try to get more teams involved. Maybe they can bring in another guy. They structured this trade so they could exceed the first apron and stay below the second apron. So that gives them a little extra, about $12 million more to spend to deepen the roster. So the restrictions are mainly they have to do 100% match, which they did in the Durant trade. They are limited to the $5.7 million taxpayer mid-level exception instead of the bigger $14 million one, but I get the feeling they won't even want to use the taxpayer mid-level. They're not allowed to trade, and they're not allowed to use any trade exceptions from the previous season. There's a couple other ones, I think, but for the most part, it's mainly those, so they wouldn't be able to increase their payroll in the trade. They can't sign and trade for...
Can't acquire a sign and traded player, right, is one of them, I believe.
Yeah, can't acquire a free agent through a sign and trade, but right now they could technically sign and trade some of their free agents to get a player under contract. So if they wanted to sign and trade like Jay Shante, Jeff Green, so don't have to trade any of the players under contract, they can do that to bring in a player under contract, right, as while being able to go above the first apron. So those are the main restrictions. It's not too bad. They could still aggregate. It's not too bad. It's manageable. They could probably still bring in another guy despite the first apron restrictions.
Okay, fantastic. And then and going a little bit backtracking here just a moment, because there was, we'll talk more about the specifics with Fred's contract here in just a second, but there was some speculation. Maybe they do pick up the option, right? So there is pretty much, in your eyes, no scenario in which they will be over the second, or they can't be, right? Because they chose to aggregate in order to acquire Kevin Durant, correct?
Yeah, as long as they do this trade that they've agreed to do, they are going to be hard capped to the second apron. And from what I think they basically, they structured where if they did pick up Fred's contract, then they could still stay below the second apron, but obviously I don't think they plan on doing that. It sounds like they're going to decline it, restructure his deal. We just saw Kyrie Irving re-sign about an hour ago with the Mavericks, where he declined his option, got 3 for $120. I get the feeling that's kind of still around what Fred's currently making. So that might add an element of complication to the negotiations where, hey, this guy just tore his ACL and just got $40 million a year. Why don't I just keep making 40 million a year? So we'll see how those negotiations play out. You would have hoped they would have agreed to something by now. But yeah, I get the feeling the Rockets are probably pushing for something where he makes something in the lower $30 million range. I guess we'll find out if sides are close or far apart.
Okay, all right, and we'll talk a little bit more too about getting access to the MLE, the taxpayer versus the non-taxpayer MLE, that kind of stuff here. Coming up, I do want to get into more on Fred VanVleet's contract and the two possible options there, maybe picking up the option and what that would look like, as well as declining it, restructuring, and what an ideal framework for that contract could look like. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by OpenPhone. Look, if you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time that you had an urgent need, maybe for a plumber or a service provider. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait around? Probably not. You moved on. That's why you need OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. OpenPhone lets you manage business calls and texts from a single app. The shared inbox feature is a game changer. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat. And OpenPhone is offering our listeners 20% off your first 6 months at openphone.com/lockedonnba. That's openphone.com/lockedonnba, openphone.com/lockedonnba. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no missed customers. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Yossi. So the biggest, I guess the next biggest domino for the Rockets this offseason is figuring out this Fred VanVleet contract. We were kind of kicking around some ideas there momentarily at the end of last segment about the Rockets' options kind of here at this point. There has been, again, widely reported the idea that they will decline the option, renegotiate a new deal. That seems like the kind of foregone conclusion at this point. It seems to me, though, and Mark Stein came out the other day and he said maybe they pick up the option, right? It's not said and done yet. If the Rockets were to pick up the option on Fred VanVleet's contract, to me, I feel like that signifies that they, have a trade in mind, that they want to use Fred's contract as kind of a salary ballast for. And we talked about that, right? They have remaining assets. They could go after another player. Maybe that's the kind of the ace up their sleeve to make one more significant move this offseason. Is there any outcome where they would pick up the contract in your eyes and not then subsequently trade Fred VanVleet? Because I can't wrap my head around that. I don't think that's a route that they would take.
I got to agree with you. I would have to imagine that's probably the case where they then have something else in mind. I just can't envision it heading that direction, because if the Rockets want to, and it's not nice to say, but they could probably play hardball with VanVleet, where they tell him, okay, well, we're going to decline your contract and this is our offer. Go try to find something like this elsewhere, which he wouldn't be able to do, because the only team who can offer more than the mid-level in free agency is the Nets. He could only get more through a sign-in trade, which would require that the Rockets cooperate, which I don't think they'd be motivated to do. And if they do want to trade him, as you said, having that $44 million salary would be the way to go. So, I'm 100% with you. I think they only pick it up if at this point, if there is a trade ready.
Okay. And I want to revisit that part of the discussion in a second, but I'm going to get very hypothetical. So I want to table that for a moment. On the flip side of it, the more than likely outcome, decline the option, renegotiate. I've seen so many different numbers thrown around for a possible Fred VanVleet, new deal. I settle in between, I feel like the proper value for Fred is somewhere between 25 to 30 million a year, something like a 3-year 90 million at the top end, maybe 3 years 75 at the low end. What do you think about that as an evaluation, or as a valuation for Fred and his contract?
I did a Rockets mock-off season earlier this month in which I valued him at like 3 for 90 something, like between 390 to 100, so like low 30s. And the reason I went off that is because last year we saw Drew Holiday and Rudy Gobert sign extensions where they took a 25% pay cut and then extended off that. And that's framework I came up with is essentially the equivalent, where Fred takes a 25% cut off the $44 million and then gets like raises. So it'd be like 33, 35, 37, something like that. So when I posted that, a lot of Rockets fans were like, that's way too much for Fred VanVleet. And so I'm like, okay, I could understand there's some frustration with him and that within the fan base, and that he's probably worth a lot less. And look, I think at some level, if you're the Rockets, you gotta, you know, you kind of have to be fair. It's like, again, look what Kyrie Irving just got. If you look around the league, yeah, Fred's not an all-star level player that Kyrie was like right before the injury. But again, you look at the Rudy Gobert, Kyrie Irving example, you kind of have to be fair. You don't want Fred to be upset or disengaged. Give him something. If they really wanted to, yeah, they could probably tell him, hey, here's 2 for 50, take it or leave it. I don't think they want to play it that way. I would guess they'd give him a little bit more, even though the market's not quite there for him. And right now, with the way things are structured, he can get basically what I propose, like 3 for 90 something. It would start him at like 31 million, and he could go slightly up. Like if they do nothing else, they just cut like Landale, they cut Aaron Holiday, they get him back on that contract, and then just add a couple minimum contracts to stay below the luxury tax. Then that's possible at him starting at like 31 million. And I think, there's got to be a little bit of perspective where the only reason Fred got this 2-year max was because it was the Rockets' way to steal him away from the Raptors 2 years ago. And the only reason he even has a team option right now is because that was I guess they originally only offered him 2 for the 2-year max, and then they put that team option as like a way to like seal it, I suppose.
It was a win for him and his agent, basically, to say, yeah, we got a 3-year max contract, and then that third year's a team option. So they're just like, okay, it's not really part of it. It's not a guarantee, right? And you're right. The loser. Sorry, go ahead.
So basically now Fred's gonna get like around what he's, I guess, quote unquote, supposed to be making, or I'd say what he probably was kind of actually worth 2 years ago, making like low 30s and then going up.
Yeah, that seems like a fair valuation. I would say, right, because the Rockets certainly paid like the loser tax to steal Fred away from Toronto originally. And I do wonder, because they've had such a positive relationship in the 2 years that he has been here, I do wonder if there's an understanding on both sides where it's like, okay, look, we overpaid to get you here in the first place. You made way more than you should have made those first 2 years. Like, now it's time for you to maybe not give some back and take like a pay cut, but getting him back down to that $25 to $30 million range, which is I think fair value for what he actually provides to the team, seems like the direction that I would expect, given all of Rafael previous contracts, negotiations. I mean, hell, he held Alperen Sengun's feet to the fire last summer during his contract extension negotiations, even though league wide, everybody looked at Alperen Sengun as a shoo-in to get like a rookie max similar to many of his counterparts in the 2021 NBA draft. And instead, Rafael Stone got him on a relatively team-friendly 5-year, I want to say it was like $188 million deal, so slightly less than what would have been the true rookie max, even though Sengun absolutely deserved the full rookie max at that point. So doesn't seem to be any hard feelings there, at least that we know of. So maybe similar circumstances possibly for Fred VanVleet and these negotiations. What I wanted to follow up on with this, though, is you mentioned, the Rockets potentially staying under the luxury tax. Obviously, so I know there are things like the repeater tax, right? Being in the luxury tax too many years, all that kind of stuff. To me, though, with the addition of KD and this like 2 to 3 year window that they have to be able to compete at the highest level, and at least my understanding from talking to individuals around the team and in the building would be that they are very committed to winning at the highest level right now. And so I would actually argue that they're probably not looking to necessarily duck the tax. So what would be the number, or what would be the outcome here, or if it's even possible for them to renegotiate Fred VanVleet and then somehow still have access to possibly the non-taxpayer MLE, or are they pretty much hamstrung into only having the taxpayer MLE at this point?
No, they could still technically have the non-tax mid-level. They can use it. I'm looking at my cap sheets really quick. Let me see. I don't know if they'd be able to do the full thing. I'd have to go over the projection, but if they are looking to get him back around that same projection I gave out. They cut the other guys and they're willing to go up to the first apron. I think they could use most of it. So maybe not the full 14, maybe like 10 to 12 million, something like that. Now, let's talk about what you said, because the Rockets are, by trading for Kevin Durant, they're saying we want OKC. We know they're about to start this potential dynasty. They're going to be dominant for years to come. We think we have a team well equipped to take them down, and KD helps us get closer to that. So I would say that's the conclusion they came with by doing this trade. And I think on some level, this team that's very physical, defensive minded, kind of are equipped to potentially beat OKC. But I don't think they're quite there, which then takes me to my favorite scenario that I've been pushing. Like I've said it on my podcast, I've written about it, I've said it on other discussions over the past few days. I think they need to address the 2 spot, and I think like they scream to me the Derrick White team right now.
They do so bad. I'm so glad you brought him up. This was me saving that extra hypothetical for Fred a moment ago. So yes, please, let's get into the Derrick White discussion.
Yeah. So look, we just saw the Celtics. They traded Drew Holiday last night. They traded Kristaps Porzingis. They saved, on my projections, over $200 million in tax, almost 250. They basically cut their expenses in half just by those 2 trades. They don't need to trade Derrick White. They're getting, like, if they want to duck the tax altogether, they can get there without trading Derrick White. They can do some other moves, which means it's going to probably take somewhat of an overpay for them to even consider trading him, which I think there is a price that, if met, the Celtics would probably accept. Probably might require some of these Suns picks. I'm curious to know, like, what is like the line you would have in these negotiations as far as like the draft equity?
Can I ask what your original framework would be for a Derrick White trade at this current juncture? Because that's the other thing is with the, I was, seeing the Porzingis trade broke, a few hours before we sat down to record this podcast. I was really hoping to get into the idea of, man, okay, the Celtics, they're in that second apron territory. They need to shed some salary. Derrick White, where are you at? Like, but now it doesn't seem like the onus isn't going to be as, I guess the pressure is not going to be as high for them to duck the tax or anything. So at this point, what's your framework, and let's go from there.
So this is where the first apron stuff comes into play, and some of those machinations I threw at you, where they can sign and trade some of their free agents to inflate their outgoing salary. Think about what the Wolves, the Knicks did last year. They signed and traded a bunch of guys so they can make up $8 million they needed to do a 100% match. That let them go all the way up to the second apron exactly. So I'm proposing, the Rockets could basically do the same thing. Like, okay, how about they keep all their core players? So that means you're keeping KD, Sengun, Adams, Jabari, Reed, Amen, Tari, like all of them, and then you are you have Jock Landale, you got Aaron Holiday, you pick them up, their options up. You can include, you could even potentially keep Cam Whitmore. That might be a little difficult squeeze, but the point is you're keeping most of your top guys. And then to get to the 100% match, Derrick White will make like 27 mil. You include like Jeff Green or Jayshawn Tate in the sign and trade to get those numbers up to get that match. Now that'd be like a more complicated trade that will involve multiple teams because the Celtics still right now can't take back guys in a sign and trade. But that's essentially the framework where if the Rockets leave the roster as is, I think they'll try to duck the tax. I know that, a lot of fans might not be happy with that, but as far as trying to extend their window, and albeit it's going to be a pretty short window because KD's 37. If you could not pay the luxury tax, practically speaking, just delay doing that, because then you start your repeater clock. The point is you want to try to have to extend your window, delay, you want to start the repeater stuff later, delay the stuff as much as possible. But if they can get a guy like Derrick White, which would require them to go up into the second apron, go above the first apron, like moderately into the tax, I think that's the type of scenario that would make maximizing their spending worth it.
Wow. I mean, adding Derrick White to this team without giving up essentially any of the core, 8 or 9 man roster and just bolstering it even further would be almost a dream come true. The three assets, right, that are the most valuable draft assets that the Rockets own would be the 27 Suns pick, the 27 Nets swap, I believe, off the top of my head. Yeah. And then the 29 Suns pick. I feel like if you could get Derrick White without giving up any of the core, I feel like you'd have to be willing to include at least 2 of those 3 assets. And in order to compete in this window, right, if they really wanted to go all full steam ahead, I think you'd have to consider doing it if Boston was willing to bite at that offer. Because the reality of the matter is, 2 years from now, the Rockets are still going to have their young core in place. They're going to have Sengun, Amin, Jabari, Tari, assuming they're able to keep all these guys together. And are they really going to have the room essentially to add another top prospect with one of those selections? Or would that essentially just be more trade fodder down the line? Not fodder, but would it be something that they utilize to add a win now piece to a core of young players that are then at that point in time, 2 years from now, more or less hitting their stride, hitting their primes, ready to start competing or continue competing at the highest level, in the aftermath, whatever, whenever KD decides to hang him up or potentially transition into a significantly lesser role with the team, whatever that ultimately looks like. I feel like if you could give yourself a better shot to win now during this window, as well as look, Derrick White, he's only 30, 31, I think. He should age pretty well too. And he's not going to be, he won't be over the hill or anything by any stretch of the imagination, 2 years from now. So I don't know. That's a tough one. It's an interesting dynamic. Yeah. And the idea of being able to get him I thought we were going to get into this whole idea of like Fred VanVleet opt in and trade him and use him as like the salary ballast to be able to get a guy like Derrick White. I will hit you.
I think they gotta team him up.
Teaming him up would be interesting. And then you go back, Jabari Smith Jr. back off the bench, Min Thompson at the 3, KD at the 4, Sengun. I mean, that would it's certainly an intriguing option. I'm going to hit you with one more super far out there hypothetical, just because Rockets fans have been clamoring for this. A subsection of them have. And then we'll move on to our final segment.
Before we move on.
Oh, sure. You got more for me?
No, I'll just say, because we're talking about like the negotiation aspect of like what that would be. I got me and my friend of my podcast, Sam Quinn, we got really into it, and he landed on, well, no, trading 2 of those 3 assets would be an overpay because Derrick White is 30 and he's not an all-star. If you're trading those, you want like an actual star. And I understand that, but that kind of like comes down to the point of this exercise where the Rockets, a guy like Derrick White might be the best guy they can get. They definitely came to that conclusion with KD. They decided not to wait around on Giannis. So in a way, yeah, I agree. That is kind of an overpay, trading 2 of those assets for a 30-year-old non-all-star. But I think after making the KD trade, it just comes back to that they decided to expedite the window for right now. You don't trade for a 37-year-old star if you're not trying to win the championship this year. So I do think they need to go somewhat more in. I wouldn't, because if you're trading a couple of those picks, you can argue it's an overpay, but it's not all your picks. You still have all your young talent. So that's just where I fall on why. That's just my argument for the case of doing it.
So you're right, but I also think the uniqueness of the KD trade, right, is that they didn't mortgage their future. They got KD for like pennies on the dollar. He was so cheap, relative to what he should, on paper add to this team. And so, that was my whole argument in the months leading up to the KD trade, is like, you make the trade because you're not mortgaging your future for a 37-year-old. You're getting off of a bad contract in Jalen Green. Yes, a top end role player in Dillon Brooks, and then the number 10 overall pick that you didn't even have space for if you made the selection in this year's draft. Like, you already have guys buried on your bench like Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore. I think the most that I'd probably go for that Derrick White deal, the more that I'm thinking about it, 2 of those picks is very steep. I would say best offer on the table would be whichever pick Boston would deem to be better out of the Suns or the Nets pick in 27 would be on the table, and then throw in Cam Whitmore. And then that's your you can get Derrick, like that would be my best offer if I'm putting on, the Rafael Stone GM hat for Houston. And then I would leave it at that, because keeping those two assets as well as the Rockets' own future picks past that is what gives them the opportunity in the potential post KD era to have enough ammunition to go get another star player if they feel they need one, consolidating some of the young talent potentially that's still left on the roster, plus some of those really juicy future draft assets, and then going and getting a guy like, well, I'm not gonna say Giannis, because by then Giannis will be 33, 34, but whoever's in that 28 to 30-year-old range that could potentially then, replace KD, on the team, or take that team over to the next level, maybe slotting as the second or third best player behind potentially an Amin Thompson, Alperen, Sengun, depending on what their continued development ultimately looks like. Coming up, I do want to hit you with my far out there hypothetical one that Rockets fans desperately want to hear about. We're going to get to that. We'll also talk about the possible extensions for Jabari Smith Jr., Tari Eason, as well as KD's possible extension, and the fact that he might reportedly be willing to give back a little bit of money, take a bit of a pay cut. We'll get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Wayfair. Look, there's nothing like stepping into your own outdoor space and feeling like you've escaped to a personal oasis. If you're wanting to update your patio this season, Wayfair has made it so easy to turn it into a space that feels like yours, comfortable, stylish, and ready for summer. Wayfair has everything that you need to level up your outdoor space: conversation sets, outdoor bars, fire pits, hot tubs, gazebos, and even the perfect string lights to set the vibe. It's like giving your backyard that resort feel without the resort price tag. Look, my girlfriend and I, we love spending time outside. We just added a few more lounge chairs outdoor from Wayfair, and it's nice. It's great for entertaining guests, whether we're out there just having some drinks on the back patio, or playing some board games outside, enjoying the weather, all that good stuff. It's our own little slice of heaven right there in our backyard, and you can create your own perfect space too. Just head on over to wayfair.com. Check out all the available offerings and selections. Don't wait. Make your outdoor space your dream oasis today with Wayfair, and enjoy it all summer long. Head to wayfair.com right now to shop a huge outdoor selection. That's wayfair.com, wayfair.com. Wayfair, every style, every home. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Yossi, this is one that Rockets fans have been beating the drum on. I don't agree with it. I don't necessarily want to see this be the outcome here. But the idea of picking up the option for Fred VanVleet and then using him as the trade bait to go get, and then you'd have to include more, but to then go get James Harden and reunite James Harden and Kevin Durant in Houston. The Rockets fans have an obsession with wanting to bring James Harden back. It was an option a couple years ago, and instead of bringing James Harden back, Ime Udoka put his foot on the floor and said, "No, I don't want James." And he, not, any slight to James, he just didn't think it was the right fit at the time. They had a younger team. They weren't really ready to win at the highest of levels. Thoughts on the idea of basically picking up that option for Fred? James Harden agrees to pick up his player option, right? And then you try to orchestrate a trade between the two organizations. Probably would need a little bit of tampering under the table to come to make it work, to figure out what that would ultimately look like, because James is only making $36.3 million on his contract. Fred would be making 44.8. But if James is like, "Hey, I'll walk in free agency," or whatever, not that there's really a team that he has a chance to walk to. Thoughts on that? That hypothetical is pretty far out there.
I did not consider that. I'd probably stay away from that if I'm the Rockets. I think they gotta. I think if you're gonna trade Fred, I think you got to get another, obviously Drew Holiday's off the board. I think you still need a defensive first guard if you're gonna trade Fred.
Yeah, I think for even though we just talked about the Rockets needing more firepower, better offense, James Harden doesn't feel like the answer at 35 years old. He'll be 36 at some point next season. Just and James is still playing at a very, very high level. But you're right. Like, the only reason the Clippers worked as well as they did this past year is they put a tremendous defensive lineup around James Harden, because he is unfortunately a defensive liability. He's not the guy you want at the point of attack. He's not going to be the guy, spearheading a top 5 defense unless you have 4 significantly plus defenders all positioned around him, pretty much at all times. And so, especially, if you're slotting him in place of Fred VanVleet, I don't know what that does. And then that locker room dynamic between him and KD for maybe the 3rd time in their career. I don't know. I don't know if that's the right direction for this franchise to ultimately go. So, all right, I just wanted to knock that one out really quickly. And there's one other one here that I feel like I feel like I shouldn't even bother you, but since we're talking about it in the confines of the kind of Rockets salary cap breakdown episode, Rockets fans really want Quentin Grimes. It's not going to happen, guys. They're not going to get Quentin Grimes. The 76ers aren't going to let him go. He's a restricted free agent. He can make up to what's his base year? It's like 22.5 million or something.
Well, that the tougher issue is that if they're going to sign it, they can't sign and trade for him without staying below the first apron, which okay. They might be able to do that depending what happens with Fred. But at the same time, I don't know if they can't give him that full amount, which means they probably wouldn't be able to get him. So I like the fit. I like the idea. But just with all those factors in mind, I'd be very surprised if they're able to pull that off.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. I mean, it's one of those ones where it sounds great. And again, I do like the fit in theory, all that good stuff, but it doesn't feel very feasible at this point. One thing that I definitely wanted to have you, illuminate for us here is Kevin Durant. The understanding was whatever team, won the KD sweepstakes, assuming it was one of his preferred destinations, quote unquote, would be in line to ink him to a contract extension worth up to 2 years and like $121 million ish. Now, we did get a report the other day from Shams that KD might be willing to take a little bit less than his potential max in order to help facilitate things here in Houston, to be able to make sure that, the Rockets are able to put, the best contending team around him. Now, that doesn't necessarily help things for this upcoming season because he can't take less than what is, currently on his on the final year of his deal. But for the subsequent years, I wanted your insight on how the over 38 rule functions and how that would impact any potential negotiations with KD on whatever an extension would look like here in Houston, if he were to give back some money, but potentially get more years. Like, how would that all function?
So all the over 38 does is make it difficult to make a contract for a 38-year-old that's more than 3 years in total, including the 3rd year. So that's why he can really only get a 2-year extension. Now, the extend and trade rules have been changed, where it used to be a much shorter starting salary on the first year of an extension, and that can also be traded. They increased it, so Kevin Durant's not really giving up any money by waiting 6 months. He could. It's like a $2 million difference if he extends now on the max versus the max he can get later. If I had to guess, I think Kevin Durant takes somewhat of a discount. I'm not talking about taking half or anything like that, but let's say he just gives back somewhere between 10 to 14 million, off the max. That's like the full mid-level right there. That's like a whole rotation player right there. So I think at this stage in his career, I think it's worth weighing, sacrificing just like a little bit to help this team be as strong as possible over the next 3 years. That would be, because that's, if he extends it for 2 years.
And when you start taking a look at a little bit further down the road, right? So the KD extension, possibly, they've already got Alperen and Sengun on the books for the next 5 years because of his extension that they inked last summer. The 2 next guys due for their extensions are both Jabari Smith Jr. and Tari Eason. And there was a little bit of reporting earlier in the offseason that the Rockets might be inclined to just let both of those guys get to restricted free agency next summer. But with teams floating out there, like potentially like the Washington Wizards, with I think they're projected to have north of $100 million in salary next offseason or something like ridiculous like that. Potentially other teams as well. how would you evaluate kind of the idea of trying to sign them now versus letting them kind of test the waters of restricted free agency and seeing if a team comes along and offers them a deal that obviously the Rockets would be allowed to match in restricted free agency, but kind of weighing the risk versus the benefits there?
So before the Kevin Durant trade, I would have thought that they would have probably tried to extend one of those guys. Now, with the uncertainty of what Durant's contract is, I wonder if that kind of delays that a little bit. Uh, you know, I think the biggest value in keeping Jabari is now he gets to play next to Durant, who's obviously like that. He's not going to be Kevin Durant, but they share a lot of attributes. Like there are some parallels in terms of their archetype. So I think they're hoping that maybe there's like a hope that by playing next to him, he can find his role and be more impactful. So I obviously by prioritizing keeping him, they still believe in him. So maybe there is an extension to be done, but it would probably have to be pretty team friendly. Like if you there's a max contract, and then there's like what guys like Trey Murphy got, Jalen Suggs at like 30 million a year. I would guess Jabari tries to push for something like that, or the Rockets comfortable committing to that right now. I would think probably not, especially if they do end up making another big move. So I'm sure they'll negotiate, they'll hold certain lines for now. I think though, there's just so many variables going on right now that most likely the Rockets, neither side could come to an agreement, and these guys end up becoming restricted free agents.
Yeah, I was using the Wizards off the top of my head because I saw somebody, and I don't know if this is accurate, and I should have fact checked myself before talking about it. But in your projections, do you have like a rough approximation for the teams next summer that might have some salary cap room to throw at a guy like a Jabari or Tari that could be kind of, competition for the Rockets to have to come along and match a deal like a, $25 to $30 million a year contract for one of those two guys?
So I look off the top of my head, like the Lakers, the Clippers right now, but like teams like that, it could change in the next week. Like they sign some guys, trade for some guys that are under contract past next season, it goes away. So right now, very early indication, there should be more cap space teams, but just so many players can sign big contracts that could easily change within a week. So all I can say is time will tell on that one.
Mm. No, that's totally fair. It's one of those where they're not, unfortunately, right. And this is not a disservice to them. They're not the star players. They're not the priority to re-sign and ink, especially when all signs are pointing to the fact that you will further down the line have to consider, a rookie scale max extension for Amin Thompson under the idea that he will likely command that depending on what kind of a leap he takes in year 3. But given his exponential growth across the first 2 seasons of his career, all signs are pointing towards the fact that he will likely command that max, and then that'll be another factor to consider on the Rockets spreadsheet a little bit further down the line, right? Yeah,
and I think that's factored into their willingness to trade Dillon Brooks right now. Was that once Amin gets paid, then you can't really. That's it. You're not gonna be able to pay Brooks. So that's a whole nother element that it's 2 years from now. That will probably also factor into these negotiations with Tari and Jabari.
Yeah, I mean, and the good news is the Rockets have, at least my personal opinion, and I think this is kind of a widely held belief, they have a pretty solid front office when it comes to making, pretty solid, contractual decisions and kind of a framework laid out by Rafael Stone, Eli Whitus and company as far as kind of mapping things out for years to come and how they, plan their financial roadmaps, all that good stuff. One thing that I didn't pick your brain about, and I'm curious your thoughts, and we will be revisiting this in a future episode, just kind of looking ahead at potential, free agency preview, that kind of stuff. But assuming if the Rockets are able to, get some version of the MLE, access to it, be it the taxpayer MLE or potentially some, maybe not all of, but some of the non-taxpayer MLE, shooting is still one of the biggest areas of need for this Rockets team. I've kicked around a few names in my head. Are there any names that you can think of off the top of your head that you would think would be a solid fit in Houston and potentially available to be swiped up for that, MLE, maybe not the full amount, but somewhere in that $10 to $12 million range?
Yeah, I'm looking at the list right now, and to be honest, I hadn't put too much thought into it because my base assumption is that they're going to try not to use the mid-level, because they're gonna just because there's just so much variability in keeping everyone. The KD trade, maybe there's another guy. Because, like, for example, let's say
And
they
actually,
do make
and
another trade.
I do apologize. Remind me really quickly. There is an outcome where they can get the mid level without entering the tax, or if they use the mid level, they will likely be in the tax. Therefore, starting that repeater clock a little bit earlier than they might want. Right.
Um, if they are in the, yeah, if they use like most of it, they'll probably get into attack just below
Okay.
the first apron. So that's another thing. But I think it's just more so about like this is not the strongest class of free agents. Uh, not a lot of shooters out there. Like you could try to get Ty Jerome. You can try to get
Luke Kennard was
like
one name.
yeah.
Seth
I just
Curry.
Yeah, it's not. I think they have a better chance of maybe using the exception at the trade exception to bring in someone, but that just then I just kind of go back to, I think they're just better off keeping the flexibility to potentially make the types of trades that we discussed, where, okay, you're not signing a free agent, but instead you're using that flexibility that would go up into the apron to bring in a real difference maker.
Okay, that makes a great deal of sense, especially some of the different options that we discussed with the sign and trade, all the dregs of the roster for Derrick White is certainly one that'll get Rockets fans riled up. You probably won some points with that suggestion. Yossi, it's been absolutely fantastic having you here for this breakdown. Let everybody know where they can track you down at to see all your fantastic work.
You guys can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky. My name is Yossi Gozlan. I am instantly breaking down all the transactions with a salary cap analysis. Been on it today. Make sure you're subscribed to Third Apron, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm doing a lot of live streams to keep up with everything and reacting. I'm going, and also the newsletter on Substack, where I do more deeper salary cap analysis.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thanks so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way to help us grow the show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.